Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room. Welcome to the room of the infinite, infinity, indeed. You know why I'm saying this. But before that, let me just mention that this video has been, this video which is going to be a video about INFJ's relationship to memory, which I'm sure I have covered before, but it has been a while since I have covered it. And so much so that I can actually not really remember the last time I spoke about it and what I was saying then. But let me just say that this video, which is going to be very important, because indeed we want to be able to answer this question, what is the memory of INFJs? Is there something useful we can say about the memory of INFJs? This was inspired by an email from a viewer whose name is Dan, and I'm just going to read a little bit of his email, just the part that's significant, so you understand the sense of direction that I want to go. And I think that this question is a question that you will have asked yourself time and time again. In fact, you might still be asking yourself this question today, all right? So this is briefly what Dan says. He says, I have one recurring troubling question regarding MBTI, which never leaves me alone, and it is something along the following lines. I am an INFJ, so Dan is an INFJ. Therefore, my functions are an IFETISE. So far, so good. We all agree on this. Apparently, NEFIT and SI are more or less unavailable to me, right? That's accepting the sort of non-shadow version that most of us embrace for simplicity's sake and other advantages. However, he says, I use these cognitions all the time. For example, with SI, I use my memory every day. And for another example, with FI, I often feel my own non-empathetic emotions. So what am I missing here? Okay, so that's the end of the quote, and that's the question that we are going to be trying to answer. Indeed, Dan is raising an important question which is often passed over in silence by people, which is the question of how can I have access to cognitions which are essential for human functioning, and here we're focusing on memory, if that seems to be barred from us by the fact that we don't have any sort of access to the SI function. But that's to take the example of memory. We could also have taken the example of emotions, but we're going to focus on memory in this video. Perhaps in a future video we'll talk about emotions. Before I move on, right? Why did I say welcome to the infinite? A rather grandiose statement, don't you think? Well, the reason why I said that is because my book, The Infinite Soul, which I've been telling you about, which is a sequel of this book, The Ecstatic Soul, which, by the way, if you haven't got it at the links below, you can get this book, reference book, Deepest Investigation, first Deepest Investigation of the INFJ, now possibly superseded by The Infinite Soul. I don't have the copy in my hands now, but the first link you'll see in the description box is to the ebook. All right. So for all of you guys, there's about a quarter to a third of my audience that prefers ebook over paperback, which is not insignificant. You can have access to it. You can purchase it right now. The link is right there below. You cannot miss it. Infinite Soul. So enjoy. It's kind of a mix of The Infinite Castle, which is my novel, which you can still get at the links below, by the way, and the Ecstatic Soul. The two together creates the beautiful Infinite Soul. So yeah, get it. And I want to say the link below that is going to give you access to the ebook will very soon be augmented by a tab to get the paperback. I have now uploaded the book, the paperback version of the book, onto Amazon. It's imminent. It could be a matter of an hour or 2 hours or a few hours, because I uploaded it yesterday. Amazon's just doing some checks, making sure that I didn't insert some porn or something in it. But no, it's ready to go out. It's going to go out any moment, so keep an eye out for that. Of course, as soon as I'm informed, I will let you know, either via a short or a community message. Okay, so The Infinite Soul is out. It's exciting, and there should probably be a little logo here to suggest that it's out. So now let's return to the question of memory. Why is Dan's question a very important question to raise, and why and how can we answer it? I think there's two possible ways of answering it. For now, I'm not making a judgment as regards which approach to answering it is better. I'm saying I can see two alternatives that at least look viable. There's one alternative that we know is not viable, and the non-viable alternative, the non-viable option, which unfortunately some people take. Often they take it implicitly without really thinking through things, is to say, well, there's no real problem. Somehow INFJs have, because it's usually acknowledged that INFJs have good memories. That's the funny thing, right? It's like, if you take our ordinary language understanding of how we relate to the function of memory, most INFJs will tell you that phenomenologically, the experience of remembering, of recalling, is something that's important to them in their everyday life. When they think creatively, when they produce content, there's this, because if you think about it, contemplation of archetypes, which are obviously in the psyche, right? It's a form of recall, because the archetypes have been formed through sedimentation over very vast stretches of time. So memory is in there, right? It's like the archetypes are the memory of the world, maybe more specifically, memory of the human existence in the world. So memory is at the core of INFJ experience, and yet we seem to hear that that SI is the memory function, right? It's the function of recall is SI. So we can't just, sort of like sweep aside the issue and say it's a non-issue. It is an issue. Perhaps this issue can be resolved easily by clarifying certain concepts. Perhaps it has to engage us along a long and substantial journey of rectification, of clarification. But nevertheless, there is something that needs to be done. So one option is in fact to substantiate the claim that SI is not the function of memory, that NI is not the function of memory, that no function that we possess is a function of memory, that we have cognitive functions is true, and cognitive functions are definers of our cognition, and they're also, as propositions and symbols that we manipulate in describing things, they are descriptors of our cognition. But memory does not fall within the ambit of those 8 cognitive functions. It's orthogonal, if you like. It's something that comes on top, and the functions don't capture it. So NI is dealing with something different, but also SI is not dealing with memory. Memory comes on top, so INFJs can perfectly well not have SI and have excellent memories, or really good memories. The other option is to say, which is another option you can say, is to say, well, somehow INFJs have access to SI. In which case, it's a rehabilitation, right, of the shadow theory. So we bring back in the concept of shadow to fill up the explanatory gaps in our account of how we function, for example, in terms of memory. Right? So those are the two most obvious available options. The memory doesn't concern the ambit of the 8 functions approach, or we have access to our shadow, right? There are the two obvious strategies. I want to suggest that there's a third strategy which we ought to consider seriously. But first, let me consider the limitations of the first and the second. I think the limitations of the first one is kind of common sense in a way, is to say, okay, why is memory not comprised among the cognitive functions? By what, according to what logic, according to what type of reasoning, do we decide that the cognitive functions, they capture a hell of a lot of things about our cognition, but somehow they don't capture anything to do with memory? It's not that it's necessarily false that they don't capture anything to do with memory, but we have to be able to explain why in a way that does not betray our wanting it to be the case because it doesn't suit us otherwise, right? Or rather that it would suit us if memory were not a part of what's covered by our cognitive functions, because at first sight we want to say yes, it is covered. There's no reason for it not to be covered. It's an essential cognitive function, right? So that's the weakness of strategy number 1. The weakness of strategy number 2 is, first of all, there's 2 weaknesses. Number 1, you invoke the shadow, and we have talked at length about all the theoretical problems that come with, in the same package as bringing back the shadow into your theory. That doesn't necessarily say that you should avoid the shadow. It does mean that you should really be careful to check whether the benefits that accrue to your theory from bringing back the shadow outweigh the drawbacks. And I've always believed that the drawbacks outweigh the benefits. And in this case, I think the drawbacks outweighing the benefits is made clear by the fact that, look, if it was a question of the shadow, and so really when we are INFJs, that is, when we are accessing our memory, we're really exploiting, channeling shadow SI. How in the world could it be good? Because the shadow is always going to be fitful, it's going to be shallow, it's always going to do its own thing, it's never going to be reliable, it's never going to have anything like the solidity and substance of the non-shadow functions. And yet, like I said, exchange words, have conversations with INFJs, and they will tell you that often they'll tell you, well, my memory is selective. Things that I'm not really interested in, I don't even register them. So it's almost more a question of concentration and attention than it is a question of memory. You don't retain, there's no retention because there's no focus. And it happens to me all the time. The things that they're interested in, the thing that I do spend time with and that they consider important, usually, it's very common for INFJs to say, my memory is really good. So how could you account for it in terms of the shadow? The shadow ought to be kind of your adversary in terms of your experiences all the time. Not your adversary in an essential sense, but more in the sense that it's always going to impinge on your experience. It's always going to sort of make your experience murkier and more mixed up. So it doesn't work. So what is this third option? Well, the third option that nobody seems to really consider, and I have to say, in order to really appreciate this third option, you need to look beyond the traditional accounts of, that you come across online, the accounts of the community at large, of the Myers-Briggs, the cognitive functions. You first of all, you return to Jung, you read about what Jung says about introverted intuition, number one, because that's your dominant function. Read again carefully what Jung says, and engage with certain models of personality types that are within what I call, these little islands that develop their own models, that are not the same as the sort of core traditional dominance, yet somehow vague conception that people have, the mainstream conception, if you want to call it that. Cognitive type is a good example. Cognitive type has a conception of recall being specifically attached to SI and NI. For cognitive type, the question is not so much, is SI recall and NI something else, is to say PI, that is to say introverted perception, so NI and SI, they're both quintessentially functions of recall. The differences are in the manner in which information is recalled. So for example, I'll summarize very briefly and simplify somewhat. Cognitive type will tell you, it's just that SI recall tends to be more fine-grained, it tends to be more discrete, right? Discrete, ET at the end, not like, you're reserved, like discrete, not continuous. It needs to be very localized. Facts and very localized remembrance and active recalling, whereas NI recall tends to be looser. It tends to be more like kind of long-term, but also more less factual. It tends to be more, it's theoretical is not quite the word, but pattern-based rather than unit-based, right? It tends to have these bigger swaths in mind, but it's quintessentially still a function of recall. So what cognitive type uses to distinguish in terms of semantics, it says it's a question of, they're both functions are steeped in time. One is local, one is translocal. Ask yourself that question. How do you feel about the idea that NI would be a function of recall, in which case you could use it to account for your memory, but it's a translocal memory rather than a local memory? You could try to if we wanted to be a little bit more creative with our language, we could say it's it's a memory that is more pattern oriented than literal, but it's still fundamentally a function of memory, function of time and memory. In a sense, I think that is what Carl Jung is getting at in his book, because look at how he describes both functions of introvert perception, PI, so SI and NI, and you'll see that the relationship to the archetype is crucial and fundamental for both. But one is more sensory, one is more intuitive, as per the names of the functions. But there is a relationship to the archetype. Our archetypes are the memory of human experience in the world, both functions and memory. So why don't we try and think about all the functions that we have as performing things that we until then thought were the domain of other functions? No, they both do the same things, SI and NI, and so in fact they have more in common than we have thought until now. But it's about the texture of the cognition. It's about the structure of the cognition. It's there that we see the differences. And so, like I said, cognitive type suggests, and I think that is one very interesting insight from cognitive type, the difference between translocal memory, local memory, and in my own words, literal memory, pattern-based memory. Let me know in the comments, and I will see you tomorrow, guys. Don't forget, you can get my ebook of the Infinite Soul, and you can also support me on Patreon, by the way. It always helps. And see you tomorrow, right? Take care, bye-bye.